Hello, the scholarly article I chose to do my video is on student attitudes and the teaching and learning of race, culture, and politics by Kathleen J. Martin. The research questions for this article um, kind of divide into two. How can we as teachers combat the misconceptions towards multicultural education and support the ideals of democratic equality? And the components of this is the idea that in education, a lot of different topics have become politicized, and even multicultural education itself has become a controversial topic, and including the ways that it's been incorporated and discussed in the media. Um, and how can we change that perspective from a more negative perspective, media wide, or at least controversial, to a more positive perspective that shows its support for creating more democratic and um, equal society. So that is one of the first perspectives that it looks at in this article. How can a class, the second one is, how can a class be created to most effectively impact student attitudes on the teaching and learning of race, culture, and politics? Um, I picked this article because it is significantly impactful to my perspective with my content area. Teaching eighth grade social studies is an entire class on early American history and looking at the history of America's development into a country. So we start by even looking at conquistadors and examining the idea of, are they conquerors, are they explorers, the importance of language and words and cultural identities. And we move through that and looking at, the beginnings of slavery and the difference between race and power. And so this article seemed to be directly relating to exactly what I teach and how to better create a more inclusive, multicultural classroom. For this study, in this article, they utilized qualitative methodology, which was a systemic um, process of surveys of students' attitudes and perceptions. One of it is analyzing a reflective paper that they did for this RCP course, which is race, culture, and politics. This is the name of the course at an American university in California, where this professor, Kathleen J. Martin, along with two other professors, conducted and collected information from these assignments and surveys to assess them. Qualitative methodology reflects the belief in a qualitative data that experience, and this is a quote from the article, experience can provide an understanding of social life and the study of groups. This means that the context is as important in understanding the information as the data itself. That's why many times throughout the article, um, one of the things I appreciated in her manuscript is that she'll have these quotes from students, and it includes the context of the student that is speaking. So, like it says, in Queens, I learned that as a young Black man, I was looked down upon by much of the society and was automatically thought to be a criminal based solely on the color of my skin, my age, as well as the way I dressed. And then it provides African American male, spring 2006. In the context of this study and looking at stereotypes, incorporation of cultural identity with classroom content, that is very important for this qualitative data collection to include things like the context of the student's background. She does also include the semester and year that this data was collected, because this data will be collected over the course of 3 years between 2005 and 2007, as shown in the table here, and involves the collection of data from 365 students. So up here is the total number of students that begin each of these semesters enrolled in this RCP course and begin this process, this course, and so they begin collecting data on them. Then as you're coming over here, the numbers and the information that was collected shows the total number of students that take the pre-assessment, and then the total number of students that take the post-assessment. Then they have a final response, which is one of their final summative assignments that they have to complete. And I'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk about data collection. But you have increased, this is whether or not they responded, that they were increased. They're more self-aware now, positive response to the course. And we'll talk more about this, but this is more just collecting like how many, when we talk about data or qualitative data on each of these elements, this just illustrates the number of students that responded to each one of these aspects. Down here where it says the pre and post inventory, which is a series of 64 questions that I'll talk about in a bit, that questionnaire did not exist until the fall of 2006. So after they evaluated their information from 2005, they and 2006, they part of 2006, they realized that they were seeing some findings that they wanted additional information on. And so fall of 2006, they implement this new questionnaire that I'm going to talk about. And that's why there's no data below this. But then they wanted that additional data above that. The other part of their, or aspect of their study, is that they wanted to incorporate the principles of confluent education framework that was taught to students so that they could use that as a part of their analysis later on. This is a holistic learning process that involves multiple aspects of the learner, including emotions, beliefs, values, and attitudes. These are the significant learning components for this study. Now, as I read through the data and the results, a couple things stood out to me as far as validity and reliability of this study. One of them incorporates the concept of modal bias, which is the impacts that are made on using qualitative methodology as a way to collect data on results through a survey process. Now, this isn't, it's how the actual interviewer or the data collector may impact the survey itself by how it was administered. So it's not the content of the survey and its validity, but how it was administered. So if the survey provider is giving it as an interview style, or if they have too many questions and they're too complex, that you might skew the results by the pacing of how you're asking the questions. Like, are you providing ample time for them to be able to answer the questions? Is it being administered at the information giver's timeliness? Is it handed out in a way that then there's anonymity? Whether or not, like they're doing it on a piece of paper on their own, or they're being questioned directly. All of these could have modal types of bias. You can reduce this with things like standardization of practice, like rate of question asking, things like that. One of the suggestions that came up when I was looking at this was providing ways to analyze, like if you do mixed modes, can you compare your results and see if it changes the results or the patterns at least drastically. Another aspect that could, or at least is worth taking into note when considering the validity and reliability of this study, is that the author is one of the professors administering the surveys and the questionnaire and grading the assignment. So, and in addition to that, there's 3 professors that did this study over the course of the 3 years, which is a really good sample size. But one of the other professors as well, who was in charge of analyzing this data, creating the pre and post-test questionnaire that had 64 questions, they were the ones also teaching this course and administering these surveys. So something to take into consideration is their significant familiarity with the questionnaire could impact how much, how they may teach or present certain questions and what emphasis they provide in certain areas, that you might get a more influenced answer or response to certain things. And so that might be something to take into consideration just when analyzing and assessing the data provided. Another key to this data when looking at the numbers that stood out to me is that for the pre and post assessments, we have 199 students that took the pre-assessment, which is not the full 365, so it's already cut down by 166 students. But then in addition to that, there's fewer students that took the post-assessment because some students who took the pre-assessment did not stay for the full length or duration of the course. Some of them dropped out or didn't continue to take the course for whatever reason. And so their data was in the pre-assessment, but will not be present in the post-assessment information that's measuring like their growth and how self-aware they are at the end. So it could lead to a more impactful, possibly, data collection of growth between their pre-assessment self-awareness and their post-assessment self-awareness. Some students who even remained in the class for the entire duration chose to opt out of the post-assessment. So something that might help with that type of skew would be to make that mandatory if you're still in the class. So those are some things that could definitely impact the validity and reliability of the study that I read. The class itself that was used to collect this data and look at how multicultural education can really impact students, their awareness, and their perception of multicultural education in general, is a required requirement for the university, the American University in California that was a part of this study, but it is not a required course itself. So students could choose from several courses, and this would just fulfill one of the general education requirements. Now, when they discussed the curriculum and the process that they went through to try and make students more familiar with multicultural education and take them through that process, it begins with some highly charged articles and discussions like white privilege and unpacking the inventory knapsack. They also read Nasarima article, which is America spelled backwards. It's supposed to talk derogatorily about this group of people, and then you find out at the end that they're really describing Americans. And it's supposed to challenge this idea of stereotypes and social construction, and they go through a discussion. And a lot of students have a lot of emotions and a perspective in the beginning. Then they move into the next kind of activity, the other part of that with the social construction, it shows the problem of difference was something else that was mentioned in the study that stood out to me. The next part that they do is they look at the systems in the United States government that are related to racial issues and how those impacted different groups of marginalized people in U.S. history, including Native Americans and other people of color. Then by week 3, the study talks about how there's kind of a shift that goes from this denial and disbelief with the introduction of every single article and every single activity that they're doing in class, and it becomes more outrage and surprise, and there's less denial or there's more acceptance with the students on the information that's being presented. And they attributed it to showing the movie The Evil Eye, which is it illustrates Jane Elliott's social experiment with some college students, where she takes blue-eyed students and makes them feel inferior and unintelligent, and all the brown-eyed students get to feel superior and intelligent, and just the impact that has on those blue-eyed students for the first time in their lives, feeling that prejudice and feeling that unfair and unfair treatment. And then from here, the study did say that they provide weekly opportunities to build community so that they build more trust with the students. So as these weeks are going, they go from being strangers in discussion to more familiar and more open for discussion. And some demographics of the participants that were a part of this study is that they're a low percentage of financially aided students. So they were more financially independent, which means that maybe more support from their parents and things like that, but fewer, no one's coming out of the university. Very few of their students have jobs. The community is a lower population density and mostly white. 68% of the school demographics was white. Average family income is $85,000 a year, so fairly affluent. And that kind of made a connection to one of the articles we read in the class as far as, and so that's kind of one of the draws I had to this article or this study as well, is it speaks to some of the learning we've done in the last couple of weeks as far as like white racial identity and anti-racist education, a catalyst for change, where it talks about becoming aware of one's whiteness and the stages of development. So when it talked about how in the study, how they went through week 1, disbelief, week 2, disbelief, week 3, outrage, it reminded me of the understanding white racial identity development, where it talks about contact, disintegration, reintegration, pseudo-independence, immersion, and then autonomy, and just the different elements described in this article that we had read through in the class. And the importance between the connections that were shown in real life practice with this and the theories that were presented in this article. So for the data, like I was saying earlier, in this, it's talking about the students would complete an assessment of group work. And in that, it provided a lot of qualitative information where they were discussing the reflections and the ideas that were presented in their coursework. And then they did an end of course observation assignment. So that's this final responses, that data collection that 295 students finished. The final responses was that they had to observe on 4 separate occasions for 30 minutes each, a social setting, and in it then they're trying to evaluate the social interactions. And what they used was the leader of inference, which was a tool that they used to teach the skill of assessing observable data, or that qualitative data. So it's a part of the qualitative methodology used that even the professors were using to assess the data they were collecting, and they were also teaching it in this multicultural education class so that the students could use that to assess and then write a paper on their observations at the end. So at the end of the course, they had these final responses that were based on these observations. The pre and post inventory was a course and attitude survey. It was 64 questions. It was a 5-point scale from strongly agree to undecided to disagree to strongly disagree. And this was, like I said, this was added after a year of them collecting data and looking through it and then deciding that I think we need more information to present and to evaluate in the study based on what they were seeing. Some of the findings, and those both relate. So all of that, the data that they were collecting relates back to the original questions where they are looking at misconceptions of multicultural education. And some of that came up in the questions that they were asking the students to respond to in that group work survey, as far as like, how has this article or how did the evil eye change your perception of white privilege, of, the privilege of having blue eyes versus brown eyes? Well, how does that relate to race? And so in some of these reflections and group work analysis, the students were responding and they were seeing the change the students were making. And then making a class that affects or impacts student attitudes on the teaching and learning of race and cultural politics. That's why they talked a lot about the self-awareness and looking at being made to sit and observe social interactions with intention made them more aware. And this is the funny part, and it came up that racism still exists. And since it's a class of predominantly white students, I feel like this had a very significant impact. I would be curious to see how this study might be impacted in a much more diverse environment, especially based on what we've read in the Good Education for All, ? Student Race and Identity Development in Multicultural Classroom by Daniela Martin, where in it, she talks about how when we increase the amount of multicultural education being put into class, it actually benefits mostly white students, because the way our schooling has been set up, a part of it is just because of the immense amount of segregation that has existed and trickled into society today. You have less opportunity for cultural interactions between the white students and our students of color that might have more cultural interaction. So the impact of multicultural education is more significant with them. So the second or another one of the findings is the importance of the course, and that it should be university-wide requirement was another finding by the students' reflections. The final reflections also showed in the inventory questionnaire an increased appreciation for hearing the opinions of others, which also helps to lend itself to that original research question where it talked about trying to efficiently or effectively impact students' like desire and attitude towards learning race and culture. One of the faculty reflections that was presented at the end of the study looked at, and this is something that stood out and was an implication for my study that I'm going to talk about in a minute, but just it talked about a need for rest. Teachers of the subject needs breaks to rejuvenate because it is exhausting. And I think that lends itself because of the exhaustive nature of trying to make sure that what is being said and what is being presented is correct. Just having to maybe correct misconceptions that students have that might be coming from home, that might be politically related, and things like that. It does provide an element of animosity and concern that I personally have also experienced in teaching early American history, discussing U.S. policies and certain military actions and things like that then, or inequities and police brutality or more sensitive subjects in a way that then doesn't offend a student that might have a family history in the military or in police work and things like that, where it doesn't go from the logic and the data that's being presented to the emotion. It can be exhausting to kind of walk that balance beam. And that was one of the major faculty reflections that stood out to me as something to really think about, and also made me consider too that if it's so exhausting for us, it's got to also be exhausting for our students who are also experiencing the anxiety of this is, maybe different than what I feel. It feels very scratchy. This isn't how my parents talk, but this is what I'm seeing as far as data, and kind of dealing with that cognitive dissonance and some of it. And so for my personal practice and getting into implications for myself, it made me consider, when teaching those heavy subjects, how do I allow for time to break up that information and give it in little digestible pieces? How do I work it into maybe a unit that allows for moving between, here's one subject that's really heavy, here's a really light subject, and then kind of going between the two, to create an environment that still pushes students, but without causing too much breaking, or causes them, unfortunately, to maybe disconnect from the learning and then is less effective in that way. Another implication that I really want to incorporate is a couple of the resources mentioned in the study. There were some really good ones, like the original Nasarama article. I'll have to figure out how I'm going to pronounce it in class when we read it aloud. But we used to actually use that in our curriculum, and we stopped using it. I don't know why, but I'd like to start the year with presenting that article. I've always referenced Jane Elliott's and her social experiment, even with her elementary school and stuff, but maybe delving a little bit deeper with that, and presenting maybe clips of the videos in class, I think might make it more impactful. And I definitely want to incorporate the leader of inference, the tool mentioned in the study, to help students understand how the social sciences gather data and how you can evaluate that qualitative and somewhat more subjective data that a social scientist needs to collect. And the final article that I thought related to this study, and it relates to all of our readings in some aspects, but it just made connections with so much of what we're reading, was Altering the Trajectory of Self-Fulfilling Prophecy, Asset-Based Pedagogy and Classroom Dynamics by Francesca A. Lopez. Just because of how much she talks about the implications of asset-based pedagogy, trying to challenge negative or disrupt negative stereotypes, so that then students feel more autonomy and comfortable in discussions in class, and the importance of cultural content integration and cultural knowledge of the teacher and their role in that in a multicultural education. And so I think that the study that I read was unbelievably engaging, but it also added validity and backed up a lot of the other articles that we have read so far for this class. And I'm really grateful that I got the opportunity to read it.